Earlier this year, just a couple of months ago really, the idea of starting a fan-selected Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame was cast out to viewers of this channel. Deciding there was no time like the present, we jumped into things with an online poll, and now we are ready to present the inaugural class of YouTube's Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. We're going to do things a little differently than announced, but it's a change I think most people will like. Wanting to keep this inaugural class somewhat exclusive, originally we were only going to induct the top 3 vote getters in 5 different polls. This standard was set with the thought that there wouldn't be that many votes, and there would likely be a lot of ties. In that case, rather than having tiebreakers, we would simply induct all of those that tied their way into quote-unquote the top 3. So the intention was always that there would likely be more than 3 in each category going in. As it turned out, the voting response was bigger than expected, and the top 3 of the 5 different polls was fairly well set. So instead of only inducting the top 3 in each category, we will induct the top 5 in each category. So there will be 29 inductees in this inaugural class. I know the math doesn't math on that, but we are also inducting recipients of the Creators Award. No, I didn't come up with a better name. And there actually was a 2-way tie for 5th place in 2 of the polls. Now, for those that don't know, the categories were based on the year wrestling personalities debuted. We had 1949 and before, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s. Voters could vote for up to 5 different people in each category, choosing from 50 different people in each poll. For this video, we won't spend a lot of time on each individual. Since there are so many people going in this year, I decided to do this announcement video, but then I will follow that up with individual videos later on to give each inductee the proper time and recognition they should get. The only alternative would be to have a 2-hour video, and I don't think any of us want that. So here is YouTube's Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame Class of 2025, the inaugural class. First, the Creators Award. This is a selection I will make myself each year. If you have been paying attention to the channel, the first recipient will not shock you. And we actually have 2 this first year. The first recipients of the Creators Award and the first inducted are Bill Mercer and Mickey Grant. Mercer and Grant planted the seed that became world-class championship wrestling and changed the way pro wrestling was presented on television. I don't feel either ever fully got the credit they deserve, so maybe this little nod from my corner of YouTube will make up for some of that. Bill Mercer was the voice of world-class championship wrestling on the syndicated world-class television show, which was produced by Mickey Grant. Of course, we'll get more into their story in another video. Bill Mercer and Mickey Grant, welcome to YouTube's Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Now here are the inductees from the fan poll. First we'll look at the 5 wrestlers that debuted in 1949 and before, which includes some true legends in the business. Placing 5th in the poll with a debut in 1947 and 5% of the vote, Johnny Valentine. A tough wrestler who spent almost 3 decades in the ring, Valentine arguably found his greatest success in Texas, Florida, and the Mid-Atlantic. Valentine feuded with the biggest names in wrestling on his way to 35 different championships, including the Texas, Florida, and both the Mid-Atlantic and WWF United States Championships. Placing 4th in the 1949 and before poll with a debut in 1932 and 7% of the vote, Gorgeous George. A flamboyant performer and one-time world champion of the original AWA, Gorgeous George poured the foundation for many modern professional wrestlers. A pioneer in pro wrestling and one of the first to use entrance music at his peak in the 1950s, he was the biggest name in the business and provided inspiration for performers both in and out of wrestling. Placing 3rd in the voting with a debut of 1905 and 8% of the vote, Ed Strangler Lewis. Only 14 years old when he debuted, by the 1920s, Lewis was the most notable professional wrestler in the business, often having his name brought up in the same breath as Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey. A 2-time world champion in the original American Wrestling Association, he went on to manage longtime NWA world champion Lou Thez after his retirement. There was a tie for first place in this category, first with a debut of 1939 and 9% of the vote, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. One of the most influential pro wrestlers in history, Rogers inspired countless wrestlers that came after him, most notably Ric Flair, who he feuded with in the 1970s. Rogers was an NWA World Champion and the first Worldwide Wrestling Federation Champion. Rogers also managed the likes of Jimmy Snuka, Dewey Robertson, and Big John Studd, among others. And tying for first in the voting with a debut in 1932 and 9% of the vote, Lou Thesz. Thesz was just the second wrestler to hold the NWA World Championship and would go on to hold the title a total of 3,749 days over 3 reigns. That's the equivalent of 10 years, 3 months, 1 week, and 2 days. He is also the first wrestler to wrestle in 7 different decades, making his last appearance in 1990 in Japan. And those are the first 5 wrestlers voted into YouTube's Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Welcome to Thesz, Rogers, Lewis, George, and Valentine. Next, here are the inductees from the 1950s category. Many of us got to see these men wrestle, at least in their later years. We'll have 6 going in, as there was a tie for 5th place. Placing tied for 5th in the voting with a debut in 1959 and 6% of the vote, Danny Hodge. Remembered as one of the great shooters in pro wrestling, Hodge was a 3-time NCAA champion and an Olympic silver medalist as an amateur. Trained for pro wrestling by Leroy McGurk and Ed Lewis, Hodge quickly became a top headliner in McGurk's tri-state territory and went on to be an 8-time NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion. And tied with Hodge for 5th in the voting with a debut in 1958 and 6% of the vote, Abdullah the Butcher. After running various gimmicks early in his career, eventually Abdullah the Butcher was born and quickly became one of the most feared heels in the business. Primarily a traveling act, Abdullah on the card meant blood in the ring. In terms of aura and bringing sheer chaos, there are few that could match what Abdullah brought to the crowd. And placing 4th in the 1950s poll with a debut in, well, it turns out 1947 with 6% of the vote, the Sheik Ed Farrat. I'll explain the confusion in the comment section. Farrat began his career as a babyface, going by the name Eddie Farrat. In 1950, he took on the Sheik persona that made him a legend in pro wrestling. Earning a reputation for bloody matches, Farrat is considered the grandfather of hardcore wrestling and was the owner and top star of Detroit's big-time wrestling through the 1960s and 1970s. Placing 3rd in the 1950s poll with a debut in 1954 and 7% of the vote, Nick Bockwinkel. A second-generation wrestler and son of Warren Bockwinkel, Nick had stints in Texas, Hawaii, and Georgia before becoming a staple in the American Wrestling Association, where he was a 4-time AWA World Champion. Bockwinkel was also a 3-time AWA World Tag Champion and is remembered as an exceptional technical wrestler and in-ring psychologist. And placing 2nd in the voting with a debut in 1953 and 8% of the vote, Fritz von Erich. The patriarch of the von Erich family, Fritz rose to fame as a heel using a Nazi sympathizer gimmick. After becoming owner of the NWA's Dallas territory in the late 1960s, Fritz became a babyface and launched an essential franchise with his sons. A 1-time AWA World Champion, Fritz held 18 different single and tag titles in his career. Running away with first place in the 1950s category with a debut in 1959 and 17% of the vote, Bruno Sammartino. The Italian strongman, Sammartino is still one of the most beloved figures in pro wrestling. Sammartino was a 2-time WWF champion with a combined total of 4,040 days with the belt, or 11 years, 3 weeks, and 4 days. His first reign of 2,803 days is still, by far, the longest reign of any incarnation of that company's championship. And those are the inductees for the 1950s. Welcome to Hodge, Abdullah, Sheik, Bockwinkel, von Erich, and Sammartino. Next up are inductees from the 1960s category. These are the established main eventers many of us grew up watching. Placing 5th in the voting with a debut in 1965 and 7% of the vote, Terry Funk. Part of the legendary Funk family from West Texas, Terry is a former NWA World Champion, holding that title for 14 months between December 1975 and February 1977. Always having a reputation for being the wild one of the Funk brothers, Terry reinvented himself in later years and became a hardcore legend to go along with the technical prowess of his earlier career. Placing 4th in the category voting with a debut in 1960 and 10% of the vote, Harley Race. Again, check the pinned comment. Race set the bar for what a world champion was through the 1970s. Winning his first world title in 1973, Race went on to be recognized as an 8-time NWA World Champion. Often referred to as a legit tough guy, Race earned his tough-as-nails reputation outside the ring as well as inside it. He would also go on to be a successful trainer and manager later in his career. Placing third in the voting with a debut in 1969 and 11% of the vote, Rowdy Roddy Piper. One of the few wrestlers in this poll that isn't remembered as being a long-time champion, though he did hold several. Piper earned his place in wrestling immortality mostly through his promos. Primarily working as a heel early in his career, his violent matches in the 1970s were legendary, and in the 1980s, he was a key component in the first WrestleMania. We have a tie for first place in the 1960s poll. First, with a debut in 1967 and 15% of the vote, Dusty Rhodes. The American Dream worked primarily as a heel when he started out and found success as part of Gary Hart's stable in Texas and tagging with Dick Murdoch as the Texas Outlaws in Missouri. It was after turning babyface in 1974 in Florida that the legend truly began. Rhodes went on to be one of the most prominent figures in pro wrestling as a wrestler, booker, and trainer. Tied for first in the 1960s poll with a debut in 1966 and 15% of the vote, Andre the Giant. One of the most beloved figures in pro wrestling history, Andre was a bona fide global star in a wrestling world made up of territories. Breaking into mainstream popularity in the 1970s, Andre was a guaranteed draw at the gate. Humbly putting the business before himself, Andre turned heel late in his career to pass the torch at WrestleMania 3. And those are the inductees from the 1960s. Welcome to Funk, Race, Piper, Rhodes, and Andre. Next are inductees that debuted in the 1970s. We really got to see these wrestlers grow into superstars. Placing fifth in the voting with a debut in 1973 and 6% of the vote, Bob Backlund. The ultimate babyface as the WWF became the WWF, Backlund spent almost 6 years as the World Wrestling Federation champion between 1978 and 1983. He also had another short run as a heel in 1994. An All-American and Division II NCAA national champion as an amateur, Backlund carried a reputation for being one of the best technical wrestlers in the business, as well as being deceptively strong. There was a tie for third place in the 1970s poll. First, also with a debut in 1973 and 7% of the vote, Randy Savage. You just did a Randy Savage impression, at least in your head. That's a living tribute to the Macho Man whose influence and popularity lives on to this day. Savage started in the Georgia territory in his father's ICW promotion, but it was his runs in the WWF and WCW that saw him make something as simple as a flying elbow drop the stuff of legend. Tied for third place in the poll with a debut in 1970 and 7% of the vote, superstar Billy Graham. Creating the mold used by Hulk Hogan, Austin Idol, and Jesse Ventura, Billy Graham experienced his greatest success as the WWF champion between 1977 and 1978. In many ways, Graham paved the road leading into the 1980s as charismatic, muscular wrestlers became the norm. Prior to wrestling, Graham was a champion bodybuilder and played in the Canadian Football League. Placing second in the voting for the 1970s with a debut in 1978 and 9% of the vote, Bret Hart. Born into pro wrestling as part of the famous Hart family, Bret the Hitman Hart started as a central figure in his father's Stampede Wrestling promotion in Calgary. After moving on to the WWF in the 1980s, Bret found success as part of a tag team with his brother-in-law Jim Neidhart, but eventually found singles success that led to being a 5-time WWF champion. First place not only ran away with the 1970s poll, but received more votes than any other wrestler in any poll. With a debut in 1972 and taking 15% of the vote, Ric Flair. Every wrestling fan at one time or another has said, "Woo!" and it's because of Ric Flair. The most well-known figure to come out of the territories, Flair was synonymous with the words world champion in the 1980s. Officially a 10-time NWA World Champion, the Nature Boy established himself as one of the greatest promos in the business. And those are the inductees from the 1970s. Welcome to Backlund, Savage, Graham, Hart, and Flair. Our final poll brings the inductees that debuted in the 1980s. Many of us were able to see these wrestlers from the beginning to the end of their careers. There was a tie for 5th place, meaning there will be 6 wrestlers going in from this poll. It's all too appropriate for the 2 tying for 5th place to go in together. Tied for 5th place with debuts in 1982 and 1983 respectively, and each taking 6% of the vote, Road Warrior Animal and Road Warrior Hawk. Part of the famous collection of wrestlers to come out of Grandma B's bar in Minnesota, Animal and Hawk began their careers separately, but it wasn't long before they came together as the most dominant tag team of the 1980s. The Road Warriors became one of the most imitated tag teams in pro wrestling history, winning top championships in the NWA, AWA, Japan, and in the WWF as the Legion of Doom. While Animal and Hawk did sporadically venture into singles matches, it was as a team that they cemented their place as pro wrestling legends and set a standard other teams tried to reach, but arguably never did. Placing 4th in the voting with a debut in 1987 and with 7% of the vote, The Undertaker. Mark Calloway worked under many names after his career got going in world class, but it wasn't until the Undertaker gimmick came along in 1990 that he was put on the road to legend status. Calloway took an idea that likely would have failed miserably with anyone else in control and became one of the most popular figures in pro wrestling history. There was a tie for 2nd in the 1980s poll, first with a debut in 1989 taking 8% of the vote, Steve Austin. Steve Austin was on the fast track up the card as soon as he debuted in the USWA, something that carried him to some success in WCW in the early 90s. But it wasn't until Steve Austin turned stone cold in the WWF in the mid-90s that he became the biggest name in the business, ushering in the Attitude Era and going on to be a 6-time WWF champion. Tied for 2nd with a debut in 1982 and with 8% of the vote, Jim Cornette. If there is a hat in pro wrestling Jim Cornette hasn't worn, it's not an important one. Primarily remembered as the manager of the Midnight Express, Cornette will forever be remembered as one of the great talkers in the business. Finished leading teams to various championships, today he does his part to keep his era of pro wrestling alive with the Jim Cornette Experience podcast. Our final inductee for 2025 took 1st place in the 1980s poll, with a debut in 1985 and taking 9% of the vote, Sting. The icon Sting cemented his place in history as the face of World Championship Wrestling. A 2-time NWA World Champion, a 4-time TNA World Champion, and a 6-time WCW World Champion, Sting stood on top of the wrestling world in front of more than one generation, knowing when to reinvent himself to ensure his flag remained planted for almost 4 decades. And that is the inaugural class for YouTube's Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Again, this was just an announcement video. I'll come out with more videos honoring these inductees over time. It's, 27 videos I'll be doing, so be patient as I try to put those together. To be clear, this isn't world-class bios level of deep dive we're talking about. These will likely be about 5 to 10 minute videos. I want to thank everyone that participated in this year's voting. I know it was somewhat thrown together, but I think it gave us a good springboard. Next year will be different with 1 poll, and we'll open up the voting a bit. Again, thank you for participating, thank you for watching, and keep an eye out for the inductee videos coming up later on. If you'd like to see more from the channel, check out the links on the end screen. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, not necessarily in that order, and I will see you next time.